I subscribe to hundreds of woodworking and maker channels here on YouTube, and out of curiosity, I did a quick check on 50 of the biggest, most popular ones. Out of those 50, I found 3 that regularly use a blade guard on their table saw. So what's going on here? Hi, I'm Steve, and this is Woodworking for Mere Mortals, a channel dedicated to teaching woodworking to beginners. If you are just starting out and don't know where to begin, you can start by downloading my free guide to setting up a shop for under $1,000 at mytoollist.com. So let's have some real talk about table saw blade guards. I feel like this is kind of an elephant in the room topic that's really worth a calm, rational discussion. I want to start out by saying that I do not in any way advocate that you use a table saw without a blade guard in place. That would be wildly irresponsible for me to do that, especially if you're brand new to using a table saw. I recommend using every safety feature that your table saw came with. I try to always emphasize safety on my show, and I think I do a pretty good job of consistently pointing out and demonstrating safe procedures. But in the real world, I have to acknowledge that many people, perhaps most people, are not using blade guards, and demonstrating safe procedures with that in mind is important. Since the beginning of time, woodworking books, magazines, and videos have issued a convenient disclaimer like this when showing cuts. And while that's partially the case with my videos, it would be dishonest for me to claim that that's the only reason why I don't use a blade guard. It's not like I put it back on whenever you're not watching. I do, however, want to stress that using a riving knife is non-negotiable, and I believe it is the single most important safety feature on a table saw. You may need to remove it when using dado blades, but for all other cuts, make sure it's in place. It will dramatically reduce the chance of kickback. Never make a cut without a riving knife in place. For this video, I'll use my rigid table saw for demonstration because honestly, I can't find the blade guard for my old saw. Most people think that the primary purpose of a blade guard is to keep your fingers safe, and that's partially correct, but its main purpose is to prevent wood from falling on a spinning blade. This can happen in different ways. The most common is from reaching over the blade to grab a cutoff piece and dropping it on the blade, which will cause it to shoot back at you at about 1,000,000 miles per hour. And that's really its main purpose. It can possibly protect you from a cutoff piece flying back at you in a kickback situation, but if you use a riving knife, you shouldn't be getting kickback. It can also keep small chips from flying into your eyes, but you should always be wearing safety glasses. A blade guard does provide some finger protection, mostly serving as a visual reminder to keep your fingers away from the blade. It can block your fingers from the side and the back, but the front of the blade is still exposed, and that's the choppy direction. Table saws cut super quick, and if your fingers are too close to the blade guard won't protect them. But it's not a bad way to remind yourself of where to position your hands before every cut, and it'll protect your hand from inadvertently skimming over the blade just by being human. And these are all compelling reasons to use a blade guard. Probably the biggest reason I don't use a blade guard is that I get better control of the wood without it in the way, especially when using the rip fence. I really like to use a gripper push block to support the board and guide it through the blade, and you can't use it at all with a blade guard in place. For me, it's a safer way to make cuts, and it gives me better control of my workpiece. The second reason I'm not a big fan of a blade guard is that it makes it difficult to see the cut being made. I admit this is kind of a weak reason because once you set up for a cut, you really don't need to look at the blade. Maybe it's just a psychological thing with me, but I actually like to see where the blade is. And if I'm cutting to a line or nibbling boards to fit something exact, being able to see the blade and the edge of the board at the same time is important. Also, the blade guard needs to be removed for cutting thin pieces or resawing lumber on its edge. It also needs to be removed when making non-through cuts, such as dados and grooves. They're sometimes ineffective when making bevel cuts, or they might need to be removed altogether. And you'll need to remove it for table saw jigs and fixtures, such as a crosscut or miter sled. So the only time when a blade guard would work work for me is when making crosscuts while using a miter gauge. And in general, these are the least likely types of cuts that a blade guard would provide protection from. Again, assuming I have all my other safety procedures in place. When making crosscuts, I'm standing to the side of the blade and both hands are on my miter gauge. And since my workpiece is usually on the miter gauge side, I have no need to reach over the blade to retrieve it. Of course, I could put it back on every time I need to make a crosscut using the miter gauge, but I don't. For me, it's sort of like wearing a helmet while driving a car. Wearing one would definitely reduce the possibility of head injury in the event of an accident, but with all the other automotive safety procedures in place, it's probably not worth it. Basically, in my workflow with my safety gear and using a push block, there are just too many common cuts I can't make with a blade guard in place. And as someone who teaches woodworking on YouTube, this puts me in an awkward situation. I mean, I need to be hyper aware of demonstrating safe woodworking practices, and I make an honest effort to always do so and to point out potential risks. But a blade guard has too many asterisks and gray areas attached to it for me to call it a non-negotiable safety accessory. It would just be hypocritical of me. My bottom line advice is this: if you're brand new to using a table saw, definitely keep the blade guard in place. If you already use a blade guard, great, don't get rid of it based on this video or my opinions. If you let someone else use your saw, make sure the blade guard is installed. Everybody's situation is unique. And if you have money, you can also look into some aftermarket overhead blade guard systems. Usually these types of hoods are for stationary high-end saws, and people mostly use them for dust extraction. Spend time learning all you can about safe table saw procedures and imagine every cut right before you're making it, knowing how you're going to position your hands and your body when you make the cut for real. Always respect the power of your table saw and understand how it works. And always wear these safety glasses. There would be glasses there if I was sawing lumber.